And thank you everyone for the warm welcome. And it's lovely to see so many familiar faces from TC and from elsewhere. Thank you so much for coming. So let me share my screen. Let me try to do this accurately. Okay, can you see that? Yeah, okay. All right. So yes, it is absolutely wonderful to be back at TC, even if only virtually for now. So a lot of you know I spent quite a few years of my life at TC and also on the SALT Journal. So I'm very happy to revisit these spaces and see all these wonderful familiar faces. Thank you for having me today and thank you for joining. And so today my talk will be on inclusion and exclusion in interaction. And I know Peter mentioned, like, feel free to post comments in chat or do the reactions or anything like that. And we'll have time later on for, we'll have time for some discussion at the end as well. So I look forward to that. So inclusion and exclusion have been a growing concern in our communities and our institutions. And I think many of us here who are in the field of education can relate to some of these issues. And I myself actually chose to focus on issues of inclusion and exclusion in my research because of my experiences as a teacher. While at TC, I was working with highly diverse student populations, and I really wanted to promote inclusion in my classroom and challenge some exclusionary practices in the classroom as well as beyond the classroom. But it wasn't easy at all. And I was looking for suggestions on how to do it. And what I was coming across wasn't very helpful to me. It tended to be very theoretical, hypothetical, and overly general. So I wanted to, take a very close microanalytic look at how we actually deal with inclusion and exclusion in real time, moment by moment, and either possibly promote it or even undermine inclusion. And the specific microanalytic approach that I decided to take is critically motivated conversation analysis and membership categorization analysis. Critically motivated because I wanted to use these methods to explore issues of exclusion and power. And just very briefly, for those of you who might not be as familiar, membership categorization analysis is a framework that examines how social categories are constructed in interaction. And it can show us how that construction process might be inclusive or exclusionary. And conversation analysis examines the detailed structure of interaction, the position, design, and delivery of verbal and visible actions. And through such close examination, we can uncover subtle practices through which we might produce, resist, or transform practices of exclusion. So that's why I chose these particular frameworks. And for my analysis, I draw on video recorded interactions from a variety of contexts, so K through 12 and adult classrooms, media interviews, and family dinners. For this talk, I'd like to kind of take you on a little tour of the different projects I've done on issues of inclusion and exclusion as they are oriented to and constructed in and through interaction. And the main two paths I've taken in these projects are examining the content of talk, so inclusive or exclusionary references to and descriptions of social groups, and the machinery of interaction, the inclusive or exclusionary turn-taking and topic management practices. And to begin with, we'll look at the content of talk. And when it comes to examining the content of talk, my main question is, what are the different social categories that appear to be constructed in interaction, be it implicitly or explicitly, and how might those constructions be inclusive or exclusionary? And I'll show you some examples of this in instances of possible isms, racial-linguistic ideologies, and audience construction. So possible isms are utterances which could be heard as racist, sexist, or otherwise exclusionary. And we call them possible isms rather than just isms because they often are designed to be very implicit and ambiguous. And they are often also walked back by speakers. And this isn't really surprising given that isms are socially sensitive and morally objectionable. And precisely because they are socially sensitive and possibleisms put interactants in precarious positions. So just imagine someone says something possibly sexist, and maybe they kind of laugh as they say it. What are you going to do? So you could also laugh, build solidarity with the speaker, but then you will undermine your moral accountability. Or you could tell that speaker that this isn't okay, you can't say that. And in that way, you maintain your moral accountability, but you undermine your solidarity or your relationship with that person. And now imagine that something like this happens in your classroom, and the person that said something possibly sexist is a student, and you need to figure out how to deal with it. You very well might have had this kind of experience, so you might not need to imagine this scenario. And I didn't really have to imagine much either, since in data that I collected in adult English second language classrooms, I found quite a few instances of students' possible-isms. And so I took a look at how teachers responded to these isms. Did they attend to solidarity or moral accountability, or somehow to both? And what I found was that teachers generally found a way to build solidarity with students around isms, even when they challenged those isms and tried to promote moral accountability. So I'll show you an example to just illustrate this. So the teacher starts her response to Veronica's possibilism with a potential agreement token, the nod and yeah, and launches a second story about her 90-year-old grandmother, who, as we later see, is very skilled at, 90-year-old grandfather, who, as we later see, is very skilled at using technology, and in some ways even more skilled than the teacher herself. However, we see that she temporarily abandons this storyline in favor of an alternative telling about her 100-year-old grandmother. And this telling is overall affiliative with Veronica's. It is yet another example of an older relative who is struggling with technology. So she doesn't know and she can't distinguish between Facebook and FaceTime. And the teacher relaunches her original second story right here, and then the 90-year-old. But she once again briefly interrupts this with a claim that this affiliates with Veronica's possibilism, a claim that the elderly not only can, but also should learn to use new technology. But the teacher notably mitigates the disaffiliated nature of her claim by attributing it to an article rather than to herself. So it's the article that says that, you know, older people can do this, not the teacher herself. And she also downgrades the validity of this claim by saying the elderly can at least like attempt to learn, which suggests that this learning process might not be successful. The teacher then once again initiates a return to her original second story with a so, which could imply some kind of logical connection between the reported capacity and benefits of learning new technology for the elderly and the story of the teacher's 90-year-old grandfather. However, she quickly replaces this so with a but, which, unlike the so preface, marks her grandfather as somehow different or out of the ordinary. He's an interesting exception rather than a logical and representative example of an elderly tech user. The teacher's story about her 90-year-old grandfather clearly now counters Veronica's earlier telling. It positions the teacher as less skilled at using certain tech devices than her much older grandfather. Interestingly, however, despite its disaffiliative nature, the teacher draws an explicit parallel between her and Veronica's tellings, calling them similar. And she later terminates the sequence with a moral which she frames as co-constructed by her and Veronica, with this agreement and confirmation token. Yeah, that's true, and the tag right. So overall, although the teacher ultimately does challenge Veronica's possibilism with a counter narrative, she repeatedly delays and packages it in an affiliative and collaborative way as an extension of Veronica's telling rather than a disagreeing counter to it. So in this case, we see the teacher attending to both solidarity and moral accountability, and she does so by specifically foregrounding points of agreement, which attend to solidarity, and backgrounding points of disagreement, which attend to moral accountability. And to me personally, it makes sense that teachers would try and find ways to maintain solidarity with their students in these kinds of situations. We all work very hard to build solidarity with our learners. It's an essential part of creating an environment conducive to learning. But if we are in fact dedicated to promoting inclusion and challenging exclusion, we need to be careful not to let that need for solidarity take over. It can be very difficult to challenge a student's possibilism, and we might be tempted to just let it pass because we don't want to cause trouble, or we might even laugh along with the student if everybody else is laughing at their possibilism. But this example, I think, illustrates that we can quite effectively balance solidarity and moral accountability. And by doing so, I think we can create a space for critical awareness and critical dialogue, along with supporting the solidarity and rapport in our classrooms. Now, looking at how social categories are constructed moment to moment can also help us uncover the potentially exclusionary ideologies that underlie those categorizations, such as racial-linguistic ideologies, which tie whiteness to English ability and exclude non-white people from the English speaker category. These ideologies are very prominent in research right now. So I think you might have also, some of us experience them in our day-to-day lives as well. They come across in comments like underhanded compliments, your English is so good, or questions like, do you speak English, which we will also see in the next example. So Heidi's ironic question, tying language ability to footwear, is hearable as an indirect criticism of the TSA agent's actual unsaid reason for asking her if she speaks English. At this point, Matthew could affiliate with Heidi by explicitly criticizing the TSA agent. Instead, however, after a 0.8-second gap, he makes this unsaid reason for the agent's question explicit by explaining that it was Heidi's appearance, or more precisely her non-whiteness, that motivated the agent's question. In this way, Matthew essentially ascribes a racial-linguistic ideology to the TSA agent, an ideology that ties whiteness to English ability. After missing his first opportunity to affiliate with Heidi back in lines 2 and 3, Matthew kind of gives a nod to Heidi's frustration by calling the agent's ideology an assumption, and then quickly and emphatically agreeing with Heidi's counter and supporting her imagined challenge to the agent. Soon, however, Matthew begins to disaffiliate with Heidi. He expresses support for this villainous TSA agent, treating their racial-linguistically motivated behavior as just objectively and generally understandable, with this deontic, you have to understand. Some interactional trouble comes up here as Heidi resists Matthew's new stance, and Matthew then, with a mitigative smiley voice and epistemic hedge, discloses that he himself might make the same assumptions as the TSA agent. Although Heidi initially treats Matthew's disclosure as laughable, Matthew non-laughingly explains his racial-linguistic assumption that a white woman would speak English. Interestingly, he cuts off his explanation and leaves implicit that just as the TSA agent, he would not necessarily assume that a non-white or Asian woman speaks English. By leaving this particular assumption implicit, he might be treating it as already evident, but he might also be treating it as somehow more problematic, possibly more exclusionary. Matthew does go on to negatively assess his assumption as wrong, but he does that somewhat half-heartedly with his epistemic downgrader, I guess, and his exaggerated delivery of wrong. And then he legitimizes the assumption as human nature, implying that it is inevitable and as such not really impeachable. And interestingly, even though Heidi initially clearly treated the TSA agents and Matthew's racial-linguistic assumptions as problematic, she now accepts them with minimal acknowledgements and goes on to treat the TSA agent's question about her language ability as irrelevant to the task at hand, rather than as exclusionary and invalid. As we can see, Heidi and Matthew in this case not only orient to, but ultimately reproduce racial-linguistic ideologies in their casual family dinner talk. Interestingly, they both, to some extent, initially tried to resist these ideologies by treating them as problematic, but they gradually abandoned this critical stance. And by the end of the sequence, they appear to accept these ideologies as inevitable and therefore unimpeachable part of human nature. Over the course of a couple of minutes, then we see how exclusionary ideologies can get reproduced and naturalized bit by bit with small concessions and acknowledgements that let them pass. Now, in this dinner conversation, exclusion was addressed fairly explicitly by formulating who the other is and why. But exclusion is very often enacted much more indirectly, especially in more public spaces. And in those cases, it can be more difficult to pinpoint, and with that, more difficult to even acknowledge, challenge, and transform it. So I'd like to share one way in which exclusion can be done indirectly in public discourse, and that is through tacit constructions of the intended audience in media interviews, and more specifically through speakers' enacted assumptions about who their audience is and what their audience's experiences and concerns are. Now, specifically be focusing on audience construction practices of one philanthropic organization, an organization which has a stated goal of helping and engaging historically disenfranchised communities in its philanthropic mission. And a microanalysis of their talk shows that the organization's representatives actually appear to exclude these communities from their messaging, instead positioning what we could broadly categorize as suburban middle class communities as their addressed target audience. So as the segment starts, we see Maureen relating the foundation's mission and projects to a generic audience with this you and positioning any listener as a potential agent of change, someone who can be engaged in the foundation's projects. But when we take a closer look at the type of involvement and health and safety issues that she brings up in her example, they wouldn't necessarily be relevant for just anyone. She specifically lists lack of sidewalks, crosswalk, and stoplights as issues that a listener might be able to relate to, which brings to mind likely a suburban community and then excludes listeners living, for instance, in big cities with plenty of sidewalks, crosswalks, and stoplights, but where other health and safety issues might be more urgent, like physical violence, verbal abuse, or lack of access to healthcare. And the solutions to these issues that Maureen offers include increased physical activity, access to fresh air, and community membership, again, rather than protection from physical or emotional harm. So, so in Maureen's example, we can see her enacted underlying assumptions about the experiences and concerns of her audience, and the potential involvement in the foundation's mission that will be relevant and relatable for her audience. And these experiences and concerns seem to be more closely tied to a suburban, likely middle-class audience rather than to an audience of historically disenfranchised poor communities that the foundation's mission is meant to help. And it is those assumed listeners that are also positioned as being potentially involved in the foundation's project and contributing to fixing the issues that their communities in particular face. Now, this kind of audience construction suggests that it is the suburban middle class communities that Maureen is trying to address and involve in the foundation's mission, which could then reinforce inequitable ideologies about who can be an agent of change and whose concerns matter the most. And I would say if the foundation actually does want to address and include more diverse communities, especially historically disenfranchised communities in their mission, it would help diversifying the platforms through which they address their audiences, diversifying their representatives, and also talking points to make them more relevant, relatable, and exclusive to diverse audiences. And in this second section of my talk, I'd like to address a somewhat different way of constructing and analyzing issues of inclusion and exclusion in interaction. And that is in terms of how these issues emerge in the machinery or the mechanical features of interaction, in the ways we take and allocate turns of talk and manage topics of talk. Think of, for instance, those debates about who tends to get interrupted in conversations and who does the interrupting, who will have longer turns of talk, whose contributions will be validated and whose contributions will be dismissed or not even acknowledged. So we've probably all witnessed or experienced these kinds of situations, and we might have explained them away with accounts like, it's because I'm the youngest, or it's because I am the oldest, or it's because I'm this gender, or I am this race, or this nationality, and so on. And one population which is very often sidelined in interactions as treated as having fewer interactional rights is actually that of young children. They are often treated as lacking competence, lacking authority, and are very often also treated as non-persons. But what's important to realize is that participants can negotiate and enact a more inclusive participation format for children in interactions, communities, and institutions. And I'll show you specifically practices of including children as equals in family and classroom interaction in this case. We'll see how here two parents include their 3-year-old daughter, Zara, as an equal participant in a family dinner conversation, even when she is not taking on a role of an active participant. And we'll see that they create a space for equal participation in this family dinner conversation, in effect, enacting kind of an egalitarian family structure. Now, as mom and dad compare their experiences with putting Zara to bed, we can clearly see that Zara is not positioned as an active conversationalist. Both mom and dad refer to her in the third person as an unaddressed, non-present other. However, dad still does orient to Zara non-verbally by shifting his gaze toward her repeatedly. So first in line 10, after completing his closing implicative second assessment of putting Zara to bed, after which we get a 0.5 second gap. Then again in line 14, after a summative statement, that's what it's about, which could again lead to a sequence closing and is again followed by a 1 second gap. And finally, he shifts his gaze to Zara in line 20 as he delivers a trail of so followed by a 1.5 second gap. So dad's gaze shifts essentially occur specifically at transition relevance places, points in the interaction when sequence closing or topic shift, along with a change in participation framework, become potentially relevant. In other words, dad seems to recurrently create an interactional space for Zara to join in the conversation by physically orienting to her and leaving a gap during which she could self-select and become a speaker and not just a figure in the interaction. While Zara does not take up any of these 3 opportunities to take a turn, she does appear to gear up for the floor by putting her juice down and kind of becoming available, physically available to take a turn. And this posture shift or gearing up notably occurs after yet another sequence closing implicative gap at a transition relevance place, even though this gap is now not accompanied by dad's gaze shift to Zara. And immediately after repositioning herself, Zara self-selects and overlap with dad to contribute to the conversation. Now, although Zara's contribution might not technically be on the topic of her being put to bed, she still delivers it as on topic, halting her dad's current telling with multiple no's and launching a story about their shared unpleasant experience. Dad immediately stops his own turn and shifts his gaze to Zara, aligning with her rather than disagreeing or disregarding or treating her telling as sequentially or topically inopposite. So including her in the conversation as opposed to sidelining her. So Zara is included as an equal participant in this family dinner conversation through subtle cues, her dad's repeated physical orientation to her and creation of an interactional space where she could change the participation framework and eventual alignment with her. And dad eventually aligns with her as she does so and takes up her topic of conversation as well. Now, work on language socialization has explored this kind of egalitarian child rearing as it comes across in very different ways. And here we see how it actually plays out moment to moment in very subtle ways. And prior research has suggested that this kind of child rearing can significantly shape a child's actions, relationships, and accomplishments outside the home as well. And it would be interesting to explore further if and how subtle interactional practices like this which lead to equal participation rights, might also allow a child to claim equal social rights beyond the home, build agency, and change prescribed social roles and relationships. And in this final segment, I'd like to show you how one child is actually included in institutional decision-making as opposed to in a family, in the classroom as opposed to in a family conversation, and how this inclusion can pave the way for them to negotiate and enact equal institutional rights. So for this, we are going to go into a third grade classroom where one student, who I call Anthony, manages to negotiate the topic for a task he needs to complete in an English writing assignment. So first, we can see that Anthony enacts equal interactional rights includes himself in this interaction by taking the floor rather than bidding for it. And with that, also initiating a new sequence or topic for discussion. Some trouble that he is experiencing, which grows into an indirect request to change the topic of his writing task. And with his request, he in effect negotiates his rights to make an instructional decision and change the topic of the task at hand. Once Fred rejects Anthony's request with a thorough account, we might expect Anthony to accept the teacher's decision and the sequence will come to a close. Anthony, however, does not back down. He resists the teacher's rejection by repeating his request. And when the teacher attempts to reassure Anthony by saying your brain will be fine, and tries to close the sequence down by tapping on Anthony's paper, Anthony once again shows resistance by rejecting the reassurance and making his request more direct. We see that the teacher now aligns with Anthony's negotiation attempt, giving him a go-ahead to elaborate on his request. Although he seems to do so somewhat impatiently with this fast pace, and ultimately again rejects the request with a hedge. Although Anthony verbally concedes, he fails to embody this concession. He only briefly holds the edge of his paper and stares straight ahead before letting the paper go and gazing around the classroom, kind of disengaging completely from the task at hand. But he still does not entirely give up on his preferred topic and continues to fight for it, as we see next. So again, enacting equal interactional rights, Anthony reiterates his request now more directly. And once again, the teacher rejects it, but Anthony displays disappointed acquiescence. He briefly then takes on a ready to write position, but now with his head down. So slightly disengaging from the task at hand. As soon as Anthony then soon starts to disengage more clearly by, as you see here in the picture, staring around the room, his head still down on his desk and his pencil now even away from his notebook, not clearly taking a writing position. Possibly noticing Anthony's disengagement, the teacher offers a compromise. He'll work together with Anthony if Anthony just copies the writing assignment from the board into his notebook. Anthony takes advantage of this offer to once again ask if he can change his task topic, and finally he receives approval. So he is essentially at this point included and validated in the instructional decision-making process. And it is only after this that we get a change in Anthony's participation. We see him engaged with a kind of upright position, looking at the board and consistently writing in his notebook. And this writing position and embodied engagement continues for about 10 minutes, even as other students go on to play a game of hangman. So in this instance, we see that a teacher manages to create a space for his learner to be included in the instructional decision-making process. And he does so by, first of all, bringing even the learner's interest and experiences into the classroom, making them a part of the task at hand, creating an interactional symmetry in the classroom, creating an opportunity for students to raise their own concerns, take turns when they want to, and also being responsive to their needs and interests and negotiating the task with them. And essentially by doing all of these things, the teacher is able to, by including the student in this, instructional decision-making process, he also creates equal institutional rights with the students, increasing their agency, and also with that, increasing their even embodied learner engagement. So I hope that this shows how, there are multiple constraints and affordances when it comes to promoting inclusion and challenging exclusion. And I do think that there are sociocultural, institutional, and relational constraints and affordances at play here, but they do come out in the interactional moment-to-moment behaviors of participants. So for instance, when we think about sociocultural affordances and constraints, we can think about egalitarian child rearing and the values that parents might bring into the home. But these values do come out in how parents create a space for their children to interact, even in just a simple family dinner conversation. When we think about institutional goals and objectives, we can see that a philanthropic organization might have certain goals in mind, but the way that they communicate those goals, their messaging or their interactional practices can in fact undermine them and be exclusionary rather than exclusive. And when it comes to relational concerns as well, we can think about how a husband might try to affiliate with his wife, even if there are larger values at play that he is also trying to orient to. And all of these divergent concerns, values, and goals ultimately do come out in the interactional practices that the participants engage in. So doing kind of a critically motivated microanalysis such as this allows us to see the micro-interactional features of talk, which are constitutive of and are constituted by macro-social issues. And I think that this kind of research, I hope, also has implications for inclusivity training. It can help reveal exclusionary practices, making them evident for participants. It can, with that, support critical self-reflection and awareness, bringing the participants in to see those practices and analyze them, examine them. With that, also to discover potential various practices for inclusion, and with that, for promoting diversity and equity in their institutions, in their communities, and personal relationships as well. So that's it. Thank you very much. I look forward to questions, comments, etc. Let me stop sharing.
All right, thank you. So we have now, time for questions. You can feel free to just raise your hand, unmute yourself, or use the chat function.
Yeah, Ali.
Thank you, Nadja, for that talk. It was really cool and interesting. I'm not quite sure. I hope I can formulate this question properly. So I'm thinking back to the excerpt that you played with the woman in the interview, and speaking to a broader audience, and you talked about how her example of worrying about having crosswalks and sidewalks for child safety could be considered exclusionary, since in other communities that may be kind of far from like the priority of safety issues. So my question is, when you're analyzing the data in this more critical framework, and those other communities and participants aren't in the actual interaction, what do you have to do as an analyst? Like, where do you draw from these other communities out there to sort of identify what other populations could be relevant to this interaction that might make it exclusionary? Like, where do you, without too much subjectivity and too much, personal thought going into it? I'm not sure if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. I think it's like, if we are using conversation analysis and membership categorization analysis, participant orientation is extremely relevant. So why am I saying that these communities are important to be included if the participants aren't treating them as important to be included? And in this particular case, my argument is based on the mission, the stated mission of this foundation. So if it's a philanthropic mission and part of that philanthropic goal is to engage and help disenfranchised communities, that is why I'm considering, okay, well, where are those communities in your messaging? Although I would say, I guess the question then can be, in general, should we always have these questions and issues in mind? So even if, let's say, a teacher does not have this stated objective of promoting inclusion and diversity, should I come in as the analyst and say, okay, the things that are you doing are or not promoting inclusion and diversity? And I think for a critical researcher, the answer would always be, well, the point is to promote inclusion and diversity. So if you are devoted to that as a researcher, then you should try to find ways to do it and point out ways that it's not done, even if participants are not explicitly stating that as their objective, because for some people out there, that is going to be important. So I don't know if I answered the question. I think immediately for that participant in that context, I think institutionally it was relevant. And I think if you are concerned with these issues as a researcher, I think you can make them relevant and just kind of have a disclaimer of why you're doing it and what the implications are. That's what I would say. Yeah. Thank you for the question. Yeah, Virginia. Hello.
Yeah, hello everybody. Hi Nadja. Thank you so much. Your research is brilliant, and I can also say your research is so important and necessary for us to think. So thank you very much. I have two questions. I'm gonna go with first one and then we'll see. So I was wondering whether it is relevant for you, or you find that in your data there are some instances where parties become relevant just contingently arise, and therefore, for example, some people join in laughing after a possibleism, or on the other side, a few people in an audience roll their eyes and you observe these. So if like the display of like joining in a party as opposing or encouraging the practice arise, and how you one person navigate the fact that in the audience or in the group or in a general multi-person composition of a setting, there's more than one person, because you said you might as a teacher laugh if other people laugh, because you draw also on the maybe treating not as problematic in the audience. But what if it's the opposite and more than one person orients as a problem? How can you navigate this? So not only one-to-one, but one-to-many in both directions. So this is one question, and I'll let you answer. And if there's time, I'll ask my second later. Thank you so
Sounds
much.
wonderful. Yeah, and thank you for coming. I really appreciate that too. So one thing that I have noticed examples when a possibilism is treated as laughable. So I do have those examples, and I have also noticed participants kind of doing I haven't noticed the eye roll. What I've noticed is somebody very lightly laughs. So let's say the person that initiates the possibilism surrounds it by laugh tokens. So makes it somehow laughable. And we can go into whether that's treating it lightly or if it's mitigating it. But some of the recipients would then slightly laugh, very, very slightly. So kind of align with that, it's laughable, but they would turn their gaze away. And there is work that suggests, kind of this gaze aversion is somewhat disaffiliative, or suggests a disaffiliation and a distancing from this person and this person's stance. So I have noticed that that's a very kind of subtle way of attending to that solidarity, right? Kind of, okay, if you laugh, I'm obligated to laugh along with you, yeah, but also protecting moral accountability, very much under the radar. That's what I've noticed. And I don't have instances where somebody laughs and the other person says, well, that's not funny. You shouldn't laugh about that. You shouldn't joke about that. And it might be because of the setting that I am dealing with. I think there are institutional constraints, and that teachers might have, teachers or other teachers because of particular goals that they have in mind, and students because of the power relations in the classroom. I think the participants avoid those kinds of face-threatening actions. But I believe that in other settings, I'm sure that it would be possible. I'm sure that it would happen. And I think it would be fascinating to see how it plays out. So that kind of one person standing out, disaffiliating with everyone else, criticizing people for treating something as laughable when it's not. But I think it's the institutional, for now, that's my thinking, that it's the institutional just setup of a classroom, especially a very socioculturally diverse classroom, that prevents anybody from standing out and saying, you know, you can't say that, you can't do that, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I would say, since you know my dinner date a little bit, that is possible, because in my dinner data, you may found somebody standing out a bit more. So yeah.
Yeah, I remember that. Yes, that's what
Yeah,
I was thinking of too.
indeed.
Yeah. Did you want to ask the other question? I think we have time.
I don't know if you want to first answer. There's a question in the chat. I'll come
Oh,
later.
sorry. Yeah, that sounds good.
Thank
So are there any resources for professors or teachers on inclusionary practices in the classroom that you would recommend? It's a very good question. I know that there are websites kind of for inclusive teaching, etc. In terms of recommending, I think there are people here that might be able to recommend things. So I will leave it to teacher trainers, maybe in the group, to share resources that they've come across. I think when it comes to resources that are built on this specific kind of research, I think they are still in progress. I don't know that there is kind of a database with these kinds of researchers informed by microanalytic analysis such as this. But if anybody, I'm going to include everybody in this process of sharing resources, if especially because I know a lot of people here work in teacher training. So unfortunately, I wish I could help more. I'm hoping to create these resources based on my research and my research with collaborative research with some of the people here. So for that, please stay tuned.
I actually kind of had a question or comment. So as a parent, I could like totally relate to the parent-child interaction, and I think it kind of reminded me there's a common sort of an interesting phenomenon that I catch myself, and I also see other parents do, is when parents actually purposely exclude children in a conversation because you actually don't want them to know what you're talking about. So for example, like I've done it, and I've seen other parents do it. They'll spell out things, right? Because you don't want the kids to know. Like instead of, like we're talking about candy, I'll say, CANDY, right? Or for in my situation where like, like a bilingual home, sometimes I'll say something in English, so my child won't like know, like what I'm saying. So I guess in your data collection, have you also run into that situation where there's like purposely, or the parents are excluding their children from being part of the conversation?
By actually creating these kind of,
Like barriers.
violating.
Yeah.
I mean, out of this data, somebody else will be able to answer this question because I have a limited access to this data. So the elements that I've looked at specifically, I haven't seen it. But I know that, people do that. Parents do kind of, I guess, will be flaunting the maxim of manner maxim, right? Making something very vague and ambiguous so that the child doesn't have access to it. And I think I would be very interested in seeing how that's done, because the child is definitely still oriented to And I would be interested, I guess, to see what does the child do in those situations? Does the child recognize that they are definitely an outsider, or do they try to get access to the conversation? Or are they given access in any other ways? So I think if you want to, Peter, kind of record those moments and share them with me for analysis, I would welcome it. Yes, we could do a collaborative project.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sounds interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Any other questions? I believe someone had a follow-up question they wanted to ask, or
I'll go ahead and self-select then.
Yes, please.
I had a more technical question on the linguistic resources somehow, because I was wondering whether you have looked, or it would be interesting, I don't know, for you to look at practices of collaborative grammar that brings the conversation in the opposite direction. And I give you an example. For example, me and Elvis and I had looked in the past at co-constructions that really use a collaborative grammar instance, which is, for example, and also, so two coordinative conjunctions. And so this co-construction adds something to the previous topic with this very coordinated way, with this very co-constructive way, but actually they disaffiliate the content of the co-constructed utterance, which is also added with coordinative conjunction. So in a certain way, linguistically collaborative disaffiliates, is used to very carefully introduce a disagreement. So I was wondering, because you were interested in unveiling, these subtle ways, I was wondering if you had looked at that, or it would be interesting a bit. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And this idea of, it seems like you are collaborating, right? It seems like on the one hand that you are agreeing, but you're actually doing something very opposite to it. And it's raising, for me, these questions of what we are calling affiliation or what we're calling disaffiliation. And I actually had a conversation about this very recently, and I am very much thinking of whether our terms for affiliation and disaffiliation are biased by the fact that much of the early data and early research on this was done on English, on a specific culture and specific preference structures. So I think I would be very interested to see how disaffiliative moves are very much done through something that appears as agreement and appears as expansion, appears as joint stance taking, but is very much not at all. I think that it's possible that we might need to kind of disentangle those terms for affiliation and disaffiliation and talk about it in slightly different ways. So I think that is fascinating. I know that I've run into trouble trying to explain it and analyze it, because I think we just put too much into those terms. So I think that's a great point, that it looks like one thing, but it's actually doing something else. So it's a methodological, I think, very important step for the conversation analysts next. One of them.
Thank you. That's fortunately, that's all the time we have for today. Just one last time, big round of applause for our speaker, Nadja.
Thank you. Applause for you. Yes, thank you very much. And yes, as Reggie mentions, there is an EMCA for RJ site where if you're interested in this type of research, you can find a lot of resources as well. It's a great space too. Thank you. And feel free to reach out to me for any other questions and things. Yeah. Okay.